This is The Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string.
Good morning and welcome to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. It's Tuesday morning. And we have a terrific show in celebration, or let's say to not celebrate, but to recognize United Nations Day and to try to identify exactly what the United Nations has done for our country or to our country. And this morning I have a couple of guests on my show. We're having a little trouble getting connected via Skype with Lord Christopher Monckton, but we also have Trevor Loudon on our show, and Trevor is a gentleman from New Zealand who's written a number of books. He's written 2 books on the Obama administration was the initial one, and then the second book that he just finished up last year was Enemies Within. And Trevor, are you on the call right now? We could start with you, and hopefully we can get Lord Monckton on a little later in the call.
Yeah, certainly. I'm here, Dan. How are you today?
Terrific. For some reason, our Skype connection isn't working with Lord Monckton the way it should, but we're going to continue to try to get him on the call. Christopher has been deeply involved, as you well know, trying to expose the UN for many years, and I just appreciate the fact that 2 of the gentlemen that are the greatest American patriots that we have right now happen to be from socialist nations offshore from the United States, and that's pretty astounding to me that we have to go to New Zealand and Great Britain to find the type of patriots that understand what socialism really is and just exactly how negative it would be for our country. Trevor, would you give folks a little bit of background on your initial connections with the Patriot movement and why you're so adamantly opposed to socialism and why you understand so well how socialism works?
Yeah, look, I've been, I grew up in New Zealand, which was a little free dental and all that kind of thing. We grew up that way. We had free milk in the schools, and my mother would get a benefit every week for our family, even though my dad was working full time. So, but that's how we thought it was. We thought that was normal. But I didn't have to pay the 66% taxes or put up with the import controls and all the other regulations that we had. And I saw saw in 1984 when we freed up the economy, and what an economic boom that provided. We got rid of the farm subsidies and that kind of thing. And the farmers created merry hell, and they drove their tractors up the steps of Parliament and that kind of thing. But within 2 or 3 years, they'd diversified out of sheep farming into wine and beef and venison and dairy, and farming boomed because the government's evil hand was taken away. So, look, I've seen socialism in my own country. I've seen it improve, and I've just got to say, unfortunately, we've just elected another socialist government in the last week. So I expect things to go downhill somewhat. But yeah, look, socialism sucks. Socialised healthcare sucks. It's if you want to know what socialised healthcare is, just go to the Indian reservations or the Veterans Administration and apply that to the whole country, and that's where you'll be. And so I don't want to see America go down that road, because if America goes socialist, its economy will be destroyed. And if your economy is destroyed, your military will be gutted. And if your military is gutted, we will live in a world controlled by Russia and China and Iran and radical Islam. So that's why I care about America. If I want to defend New Zealand, we have to defend America.
Well, that certainly explains a lot of what you're concerned about, and I have to tell our listeners that I think all of us that have been in the Patriot movement for a while realize that much of the thought or the idea that communism died with the fall of the Soviet Union is really a false paradigm, and that I am astounded that most people don't think more about the fact that our largest trading partner is communist China. Who would have dreamed that 50 years ago? Who would have dreamed that we would be literally funding our ideological enemies? And the fact is we are losing our country right before our very eyes, because we're not only allowing this to happen, but we're actually paying for it. It's like hanging yourself and then bringing the rope with you. That's exactly what we're doing.
Well, Lenin famously said that the capitalists would compete amongst themselves to sell the Soviets a rope with which to hang them. And, right now, America is doing huge amounts of trade with communist China, while China is building 60 ships a year and America's building 10, and is building up its army tremendously, and is basically funding subversive movements all around the world. And to keep the cheap goods in Walmart, America is basically destroying its national security and its national integrity. And you see that you see that all over with Chinese politicians buying up, getting influence in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party right up and down the west coast of America.
You're right on the money on that, Trevor. And I'm going to read a statement by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987 before the Russian Politburo. And I have to read this because it explains a lot of what's going on right now. And this is a quote, "In October 1917, we parted with the old world, rejecting it once and for all. We are moving to a new world, the world of communism. We shall never turn off that road. Comrades, do not be concerned about all that you hear about glasnost and perestroika and democracy in the coming years. These are primarily for outward consumption. There will be no significant internal change within the Soviet Union other than for cosmetic purposes. Our purpose is to disarm the Americans and let them fall asleep." Now, that falls perfectly in line with the Antonio Gramsci and the prison notebooks, and that's basically a way to get communism throughout our system and do it very clandestinely, very quietly, and do it at the local political level rather than doing it at the point of a gun.
Yeah, well, look, I interviewed a man in New Zealand back in the 80s who in 1983, this is before Gorbachev came on the scene, in 1983 trained in Moscow at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning, the big communist training school there. There were 6,000 students there at the time. And they were told at that point that communism would basically be de-emphasized, that there would be a big opening to the West, a sort of glasnost. There would be because communism did much better in times of détente than it did in times of antagonism, and that the Communist Party would be de-emphasized, there'd be a mass democratization. But this was basically a method of disarming the West, that the West would just think communism had gone away and really emphasize other things and disarm its military. Now you have Russia has 3 times more nukes than America. America hasn't built a new nuclear weapon since 1992, so many of them are borderline obsolete, while Russia's are all state-of-the-art, brand new. It has got a massively bigger conventional forces than America, and it's allied with China. You know, Vladimir Putin this week opened an international communist youth gathering in Sochi, Russia. 50,000 young communists from around the world gathering there to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. And Vladimir Putin opened the event and personally intervened to get these young communists that venue. So what does that tell you about the genuine decommunization of Russia? You know, the KGB that ran Russia right through the Cold War is even more powerful in Russia today, is still working with the Cubans, still agitating inside America, and Vladimir Putin, their leader, is openly working with the communists in Russia today. So we've made a few strategic errors, I think, in the Cold War. We thought it was over, and it wasn't.
Right, and that's exactly what they meant when they said that they would allow us to fall asleep, or that's what Gorbachev meant. And, you know, it appears to me that our whole internal makeup of our country has totally changed in the last 20 years, and it's because of our so-called leadership. Our progressives throughout both parties in the political process, and it especially went into hyperdrive under Barack Obama. And I know that they anticipated that Hillary Clinton would be the next president, because literally all of the media throughout our nation was in her camp and in her, because they've been bought and paid for a long time ago. We have not had real news and a real media in this country that is truly unbiased and truly trying to report the facts for a very long time.
Probably not since before World War II, you know. You know, you think about it, after World War II is when they started to train journalists in the journalism colleges. Before that, most journalists were like apprentices. They'd work in a local newspaper and they'd go and follow the local baseball games and court cases, etc. And they were pretty much normal Americans with normal American values. But after World War II, most journalists began to be trained in the journalism colleges, and they read textbooks by people like Curtis McDougall, a communist sympathizer who basically invented advocacy journalism. You know, your job is not to report the news, your job is to shape the news. So now you have 80% of American journalists self-identifying as liberal, which is way out of whack of the proportion in the population, and the 20% conservative journalists are mainly so intimidated by political correctness or by their membership of the journalists' union or just general cowardice that most of them toe the line as well. So you have a very, very few real, honest journalists left in the country, and if it wasn't for alternatives, you know, for stations like yours, Dan, we would hardly have any. Right.
And, you know, the media in this country has really, really changed over the last, over the last 20 years in a really remarkable way, because we used to at least think that there was some semblance of truth to the mainstream media. And I know that's, the term fake news has become the norm in the United States because of that fake news, because of the media being in the pocket and the control of this oligarch of internationalists, of globalists. I've got another statement here that I have to add to this, and this was from Norman Thomas. He was the six-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America and the Communist Party USA. And this is the quote, the American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened, unquote. That's, we're being conquered by stealth. And now we've gone from a nation conquered through stealth to a nation that is being overwhelmed by groups like Antifa. And I certainly, Trevor, I know that your background on this stuff, you know this stuff extremely well. You've written books, you've done movies about it. These groups that are coming in now, they are openly communist, and for some reason, the American people seem to accept that and don't seem to be alarmed by it.
Well, you're right. See, the media is overwhelmingly to the left. The Democratic Party has been completely taken over by Marxists. Like, I read the communist press on a daily basis, and Democratic Socialists of America and the Communist Party USA, if you compare their programs to that of the Democratic Party, you will not find a difference. They're completely in tune. The communists control the unions, and the unions control the Democratic Party. The communists set the policies, they make it union policy, and the Democrats adopt it. That's why you have a nuclear deal with Iran. That's why you have Obamacare forced down your throat. That's why you have immigration amnesty. That's why you have normalization relations with Cuba, because all of those are communist policies that become union policies, and the unions make them Democrat policies. And now, with the Democrats were almost sure that they were going to have a one-party state after the last election. They were, because their plan was, as Hillary Clinton said, after the election, within 100 days of office, she was going to legalize and give voting rights to all of the illegal immigrants in the country. Now, that is between 12 and 30 million people, and they will vote at least 80% Democrat. So the Democrats were going to get between 10 and 24 million new votes. Now, considering that Mitt Romney lost by 2.5 million votes and Donald Trump won by about 200,000, that would have given the Democrats permanent control of this country. And the Democrats are controlled by the unions, and the unions are controlled by the communists. So they were on the verge of a one-party state. They were that close. And when Donald Trump upset their Apple Cart, they're like a bunch of kids who thought they were going to get a bike for Christmas, and they got a pair of socks. They are angry, and they are doing everything they can to discredit Donald Trump. That's why you're seeing Black Lives Matter on the streets. That's why you're seeing Antifa on the streets. Both complete communist movements, because they are absolutely desperate to bring down Trump, and they're showing their hand, their true hand, in ways they've never shown before. So if the American people think that communism has gone away, just think about Antifa, think about Black Lives Matter. Both of them are really the military wing of the Democratic Party, and that's where we are today, where these people are really trying to create so much chaos that this government collapses and is replaced by a Democratic administration, which will really be a communist administration.
And not only will it be a totalitarian system that they want in place, they seem to think that somehow, the communists, when I say this, seem to think somehow that the system will be better if they destroy our individualism, our nationalism, our rights of the individual in this country under a collectivist system. They live under this utopian dream that somehow the system is going to be better for the people, when in fact communism has, everywhere it's occurred, has been very detrimental to the rights of the people. They need to understand this. These people are the useful idiots that you refer to.
Well, see, and you're right, but there's two levels of this. You've got the idealistic young communists who really believe that communism will improve the lives of the people. And the reason, and when you say, well, look, it's failed everywhere, well, they have a ready answer to that. They'll say, well, yeah, that's because America sabotaged it. America drove Russia into bankruptcy. America isolated Cuba. America is now trying to bring down Venezuela. They'll say everywhere communism tried to take root, America sabotaged it, crippled it, whatever. So America is the fault. America is the reason communism hasn't worked. So the logical outcome of that is, well, for communism to work, you need to get rid of America, which is why you have all these anti-American groups like Antifa, who were chanting the other day, no Trump, no wall, no USA at all, no Trump, no wall, no USA at all. Now, doesn't that tell you what they're aiming at? So then you have a higher level of communists, the real, who know that communism has nothing to do with redistribution of wealth, nothing to do with sharing the wealth or the power. It's all about centralized control. It's all about totalitarianism. So you've got the useful idiots who really believe that communism's okay, but then you've got the smart ones who understand it's all about power, and they want to have the power. You know, these are the people motivated by the same reason that Satan left heaven. It's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, according to these people. They don't care what America turns out like. They don't care how the people starve. They don't give a damn. All they want is power, and they'll do anything they can to get it, and the communist movement is their vehicle for achieving it.
Right, and we're fighting for our very existence in this country, if people would realize that. Because, you know, the bottom line is, if they get their way, our country will lose all of its wealth. It will turn into a country that's totally controlled by someone else in a command economy. And there will be no middle class. There will be the very, very rich have always controlled, and the very, very poor, which will be 99% of the population, which will be the rest of us. And people need to understand how important that they stand up and be counted now, because if we don't stand up now and say enough is enough, we love our system of government, we love our constitutional republic, we are not a democracy, we are a republic under rule of law, and if we don't start standing up for that, it's going to be too late, Trevor. And you certainly point that out in your book, and you point that out in your movie.
Well, yeah, like, you know, this country is very infiltrated because the movie I put, the movie particularly, and people can get that at enemieswithinmovie.com. It's had well over 100,000 views on Amazon Prime in the last month, because what it shows is the degree that the United States government, the Congress and the Senate, have been infiltrated by people with communist and Muslim Brotherhood connections. We say there's at least 100 members of the House and 20 members of the U.S. Senate, including Montana's John Tester, who are so enmeshed in neo-communism, Muslim Brotherhood front groups, or both, They couldn't pass an FBI background check to drive a school bus. Yet they're serving on all these powerful committees. They're serving on the Education Committee and the Armed Services Committee and the Homeland Security Committee and the Intelligence Committee, and they are trashing American Constitution every chance they get. And what they want to do eventually is to turn America into just an impoverished serf state of some United Nations world super government. And but they still swear this oath to the Constitution, to protect the Constitution from enemies, foreign and domestic. And they are the domestic enemy, and they're working on behalf of an elite, of a globalist elite. And Americans need to understand just how close it is to the end game for these guys.
Welcome back to our Connecting the Dots show. I apologize to our listeners and to our guests. We're working with some new technology for me here, and frankly, I've been falling down on the job. I'm working with Skype, and I disconnected myself during the last half hour, but we'll try to make sure that we don't do that again. Trevor, you were talking about the different groups that have really taken over our Congress through the influence peddling that they've done, and how we literally have somewhere close to 100 or maybe slightly over 100 of our members of Congress who are actively working with the communists and the socialist parties, and have pledged their support and their assistance to these groups to literally take over and destroy our constitutional Republican form of government. Now, this is outright treason. Why in the world have we allowed this to go on this way? Has it worked so stealthily that the average American hasn't been able to figure it out?
Well, look, you've got to meet the first thing that the communists needed to do when they wanted to take down America, or one of the first things they needed to do was to take control of the media, which they really did through the journalism colleges in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. So now, and coupled with that, so the media is slanted.
I think we may have lost our connection on that. At this point, Trevor, if you're online, please try to reconnect, and we'll try to do that again.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Okay, great. All right. Go ahead and finish up that thought. I'm sorry if I broke in.
No, so the problem is you've got a media that's very left-controlled, and you have political correctness, which is cultural Marxism, which defines the arguments. You cannot talk about certain things in America without being labeled a racist or a xenophobe or some other sort of phobe. So those two things, the left-wing media, which is viciously left-wing, and we saw that in the presidential election cycle, coupled with political correctness, means that the public is not exposed to the full range of debate. And anything to do with socialism or communism is pretty much off the table. And if you bring up the communist backgrounds of your representatives or senators, the automatic charge is McCarthyism, a phrase that was coined by the Communist Party newspaper, The Daily World. So that's supposed to shut down any debate about communism, just like racism is supposed to shut down any debate about, securing the borders, etc. So, so you have a situation where a young Marxist like Barbara Lee or Rosa DeLauro or Elizabeth Warren can get elected to the Congress or the Senate. The media is not going to expose their background. The media is going to discourage anybody from doing so. And when they get into Congress, there are no security background checks at all to serve on any of these committees. So these people who couldn't pass any form of FBI background security clearance are able to serve on the Intelligence Committee, the Education Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, the Finance Committee, etc., to use their influence against America's sovereignty. So the big problem is the media, because and the political correctness that goes with it, which means that most Americans have no comprehension of this problem whatsoever.
Right, and not only do they not have a whole lot of comprehension of the problem, they also tend to, we've seen a level of fear and fear of being labeled in this country that I wouldn't have believed we would ever see in my lifetime. And people are so conditioned with this political correctness garbage that they just the level of fear is to the point where it's almost paranoia.
It is, and people need to understand political correctness is cultural Marxism. This is communism in the culture. It was invented or spurred on by Antonio Gramsci, one of the top leaders of the Italian Communist Party, and it has seeped right through the universities, right through the media, right through the culture, to the point where Americans can only say a limited amount of things. And if you step away from that narrative, they've got all these weapons to smash you with: racism, xenophobe, homophobe, Islamophobe. These are the automatic weapons used by the cultural Marxists to stifle opposition. Well, I say, and the reason that Donald Trump resonated with the people as much as he did is because he poked a big fat hole in that political correctness and just said what he wanted. And so I think for America to survive, more of us have to follow that example and just remember the old adage: sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. You know, just break through the fear and say it as it is.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that the thing that Trump brings to is the fact that he is so unwilling to roll over to these people, and that fear of him is for the almost maniacal attempts to try to destroy him in any way they can. And it shows me that really he's right. He's doing the right thing, because if he wasn't, you wouldn't see this kind of resistance to every single thing he does and every single thing about his personality. And incidentally, and Trevor, you're certainly aware of this, the difference between a fascist and a communist is they're basically two sides of the same coin. They both believe in totalitarian systems, but a fascist and a communist both believe in total control by a government entity. And for them to call the free market thinkers fascists or anything other than what they are, which is control freaks, is really totally wrong.
Yeah, well, we saw this in our recent movie, Antifa. People can see this online. Just go to Google it for free. It's America Under Siege, Antifa. And we trace the history of the Antifa movement. And it goes right back to the Russian Revolution and Leon Trotsky. But in Germany in the 1930s, Antifa was set up by the German Communist Party to oppose the Nazis. But when the Nazis won, they basically, a whole bunch of the Antifa and the German communists switched sides and joined the brown shirts. 55% of Hitler's brown shirts were former communists or socialists. There is no difference. They are both thug systems. So if one thug comes out on top, they just go and switch sides. Just like if one mafia gang gets smashed, the survivors will go and join the other mafia gang. And the only reason that Nazism was labeled as a right-wing phenomenon rather than the left-wing phenomenon that it is because when Stalin was fighting the Nazis for control, he had to differentiate them from the communists who were left-wing, so he called them right-wing, which also enabled him to use that smear to attack normal constitutional Americans and free enterprise people, etc. You see, you got Antifa on the streets now creating mayhem in cities around the country. Antifa is short for anti-fascist, and they say they oppose fascists and Nazis. But what we have to understand is that their definition of a fascist is anyone who voted for Donald Trump, anyone who believes in securing the borders, anyone who believes in the American Constitution. So Antifa is an anti-American communist operation. Their definition of fascism is so broad that it includes anybody who stands up for America effectively.
Right, and that is the thing that's so hard or so difficult for most Americans to understand. We've been taught throughout the years that fascism and communism are opposite sides of the political spectrum, when in fact they're both on the same side. They're both on the hard left, and the political opposite of either fascism or communism is anarchy, which is total lack of any government. And when our founders, in their brilliance, put together our constitutional republican system, we were somewhere in the middle, but slightly to the right of center, because our system was designed to be of, by, and for the people. It was intended to be the individual as the sovereign, which is totally the opposite of either fascism or communism. And people, hear the term Nazi. Well, Nazi means National Socialist Party. That's basically what they were. Well, there's not any difference between the two. It's just how they get to their I guess, final goal. And the final goal of either one is a system that's totally controlled by a central system, a very overreaching, very concentrated, powerful central system that controls everyone.
Yeah. Well, the American left, the American socialists, they believe in single-payer health care where everybody is looked after by the state, and they believe in government control over the corporations. Well, guess what? So did Adolf Hitler. He believed in both of those things. He believed in a strongly centralized state. The only difference between him and the communists was he was more nationally and racially focused, and they were more internationally focused. That's the only difference. They're both totalitarian systems. It's such a joke when you see the Antifa people out in the street pretending to be anti-fascist, when they're the most fascist organization in the country right now. And their target are normal mainstream Americans who, as you say, believe in a constitutional republic where the people are the masters and the government is the servant. That's completely the opposite of fascism, which believes the state rules everything, just like communism. And we, it's United Nations Day, and we should acknowledge that the biggest potential world superstate looming out there now is the United Nations, the architect of which was Soviet spy Alger Hiss, a complete communist operation. And we're taught on United Nations Day to welcome this organization and praise its virtues, of which there are none. So, I think it's quite appropriate to talk about tyranny on United Nations Day, because there's no more greater potential tyranny out there than that organization.
Well, and they call it the Dictators Club for a good reason, but the fact is there are only a very, very, very limited few people or nations in the United Nations that believe in limited constitutional government. And even of those, I think the United States is really, or was, and I don't know if we're still that way, but was the only true republic that believed in a constitution. And I just think we're at a point where we're so overwhelmed by all these other nations of the world who they want us to pay for everything, but they want to destroy our system. And people in our listeners need to understand just how important it is that we fight back.
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you what was really gratifying. The United Nations has a sub-organization, UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, always been completely controlled by the communists. It's even worse than the main United Nations body itself, and that is where a lot of your school textbooks come out of, a lot of the historical narratives come out of UNESCO and get filtered into countries all over the world. Well, Donald Trump just signaled that America is going to withdraw from UNESCO at the end of next year because of its militant anti-Israel bias. Well, that's only one of the reasons you should withdraw from UNESCO. But that's great, you know. Reagan pulled America out of UNESCO because of its communism. George Bush, too, put America back in 2003, much to his great disgrace. And it's very commendable that Donald Trump has signaled that America is going to be leaving UNESCO and no longer paying the bills for UNESCO. And I just hope that's a precursor to completely withdrawing from the main United Nations itself, because that would be a huge boon for freedom for Americans, and it would collapse the United Nations because America pays about 20% of its bills, or more, I believe, actually, which is disgusting in itself. So full marks to the president for making that move.
I agree. Yeah, he also really wanted to make sure that our system of government returns somewhat anyway to our founders' vision, and he's been working on that. And I know that's one of the reasons that Antifa and some of these communist organizations have their tail in a wad, is because the moves by President Trump have been in your face to the globalists, and I see globalists on both sides of the political aisle. It's not like there's one without the other. I hate to say it, but I mean a lot of the Republican Party has the same level of progressive socialists that the Democrats. Maybe right is overt, but very much have some of the same characteristics.
Yeah, well, I would say the Democrats have now been totally taken over. You know, once you had the Democrats and Republicans weren't that different, you know, and Harry Truman and JFK were patriotic Americans. But the Democrats, especially since 1995, when the communists took over the AFL-CIO under John Sweeney, the Democrats have gone way, way, way to the left. About a third of the Republicans I regard as big government, globalist progressives. I think about a third of them wouldn't know how to tie their own shoelaces, and a third of them, maybe a quarter, are constitutionalists and patriots. So we have a very narrow band of politicians who are actually on our side. And some of the Republicans are real bad. Most of the Democrats are being completely subverted. So we got to realize just how thin the layer is that's protecting us from tyranny. We're only hanging on by our fingernails here, and that's why the left are so absolutely livid with Trump, because they had it in the bag. They were going to legalize all of the illegals, and we would have been done. But they understand that if President Trump can restore the Constitution, or we can together restore the Constitution, because it's not down to Trump. But if we can get on top of the economy, lower the taxes, get the regulations off business, close the borders to stop the flow of drugs from Mexico and the flow of undocumented Democrats, stop the Islamic refugee resettlement from the Middle East, which is being organized totally by the Communist United Nations. If we can do all of those things and turn America around, that will completely realign U.S. politics. And the communists and Democrats understand that'll keep them out of power for 50 years. That's why they're so absolutely freaking. That's why their vitriol is so intense, because they had it in the bag, they got it taken away from them, and 50 years of work could be undone if this president is successful. That's why we have to make sure this is a successful presidency, and we get behind the good things that Trump's doing, give him a hard time if he does anything bad, and really work together to turn this around.
Well, and that's one of the reasons, too, that it's so important for Americans, for our listeners to understand that we're on a very limited time frame to return to a constitutional government. And we may have a president that only has 3 years of his term left. And I think the fact that they are so vitriolic is that they see that we're exposing the fallacy of the left. We're exposing where these people are really coming from, and they know that they've got a limited time to be able to accomplish their goals, and that's the cause of the panic. Trevor, you've been very good at showing Americans how that whole system is structured and how it's so important for people to wake up.
Well, yeah, look, anybody cares about freedom has to care about America. But you're right that the time span is very limited. You know, we're only a year away from the midterm elections, and the Democrats are doing everything they can. They're going through the South right now, signing up hundreds of thousands of low-income voters, black voters, Latino voters, Muslim American voters. They're really trying to fire up their base in the southern states to flip some of those southern states to their side. And we shouldn't be complacent about this, because if they can, if Trump loses the House or the Senate in the next election, that's the end of it. You know, the agenda stalls from that point onwards. And in 2020, their plan is to basically stall Trump in every possible way they can, stop his agenda so that his base is disillusioned, that nothing really happens, the wall isn't built, etc. And then they're going to run candidates like Cory Booker, the black senator from New Jersey, Kamala Harris, the black and Asian senator from California, in an effort to revitalize their base. You know, the white progressive voters, the Latino voters, the Asian American voters, the black voters, etc. Their plan is to rebuild Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition of the 1980s. Win by motivating the progressive base and destroying the conservative base. And if Trump is not successful, doesn't get much through, there's a real danger that will happen. We will have a Democrat president in 2020. They will legalize every illegal immigrant in the country. They will ramp up refugee resettlement from the Middle East with the help of the United Nations, and they will turn conservative American Christians into a very small minority in their own country and a very much persecuted minority. That's what we face if we allow this presidency to fail. So every American has to get involved in this. Every American has to start fighting for his country or intensify the fight if you're already involved.
Right. And I know that part of, obviously, the concern that you have and many of us have is that there are so many holdovers in the administration from the Obama administration, because under President Obama, he filled an awful lot of these bureaucratic agencies, the areas where they're non-elected. He filled with Marxists, and he filled with people that he knew would push this agenda. And many of those agencies still have those people in place.
Absolutely. They are running things, you know. Trump has promised to drain the swamp, but he's hardly done that at all. And that's what's stalling him right now. He needs to just take a broom and sweep these agencies clear. And I'm talking the intelligence agencies as well. And the other big issue that's stopping the Trump agenda is the fact that he doesn't have a very good majority in the U.S. Senate, because he's got a majority, but he has John McCain and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who are effectively working as Democrats. And so Steve Bannon has a plan right now to, there's 8 Republicans coming up for election in 2018 in the Senate. And Steve Bannon is trying to organise primary challenges against 7 of them, all except for Ted Cruz, who's already a constitutionalist.
Welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and our guest today is Mr. Trevor Loudon. Trevor is a writer and a movie producer, and also a very patriotic American, even though he's from New Zealand. So, Trevor, I hope you'll finish up your thoughts. I'm sorry we had to cut in on your thought for the commercial break, but please finish that thought, and then I'm going to bring up a news clip that I just read.
Yeah, well, thank you. Steve, I think one of the main, people always ask me, what can I do, to help over the next year or so? And one of the biggest things I think we can all do is get behind Steve Bannon's effort to primary out 7 of the leading Republican rhino senators and replace them with good conservatives. See, you saw down in Alabama recently, there was a primary race there between Luther Strange, the rhino candidate, and Judge Roy Moore, who's a very strong constitutionalist, a very strong conservative Christian. Now, Roy Moore easily won that race and will win the final race to go to the U.S. Senate. Now, if we can primary out another 7 or 5 or 6 rhino senators and replace them with really good conservatives, that's going to make it so much easier for President Trump to get his agenda through. So that's something every American can be involved in. If you're in one of the states that Bannon is targeting, there's 8 Republican senators up for election in 2018. If you're in one of those states, get behind the effort to find the best possible conservative replacement for your existing senator and back Steve Bannon's effort as much as you can with your money, your phone banking, your time, etc. And if you're not in one of those states, you don't have to be there. Send the money across state lines, phone bank, do anything you can to help that effort, because if one thing is going to turn America around in the next few years is to get the Senate full of, to get a balance of power in the Senate where real conservatives can help the president get his agenda through. If we don't do that, President Trump's going to come to 2020 with not very much done, and he or a successor will likely fail at that time.
Right, and I know for a fact that America really is a conservative nation. Whether we vote that way all the time consistently or not, we have traditional values in this country, but we haven't followed up with really supporting those traditional values for a very long time. And, most Americans, even the ones that believe in having a stronger centralized government that provides for people, when they see the truth of how effectively that ends up being a huge mountain of debt for our kids and our grandkids, most people back away. Most people are conscientious enough that they believe we need to return to a system where we're not so totally in debt. And I think probably, Trevor, one of the things that, that your book and your lectures talk about is that very fact that even though we've come an awfully long distance toward the left, our country still has the same values that would bring them back to a more constitutional form of government if we just exercised our rights and recognized that things are really happening.
Yeah, I think the left has been very frustrated and exactly how stubborn Americans are. You know, how stubbornly Americans hold to their traditional values, to their constitution, to their support for the free enterprise system, for their support for America's, military. You know, it's very hard to knock the patriotism out of Americans. It's so much part of Americans that even with 50 years of indoctrination in the schools and a left-wing media, there is still enough Americans out there who love their country and love the Constitution to do the right thing when it comes to the crunch. And that really shocked the left in the last election. They thought they had indoctrinated Americans enough. They thought they had enough control over the media. They believed their own BS. They believed their own propaganda. And that's why on election night they were so shocked, because a whole bunch of Americans basically just said, to hell with this, we're going to vote for our country. And they did. And that's why you saw, on election night, they panned Hillary Clinton's headquarters, and all these snowflakes were bawling their eyes out, because they were just so absolutely shocked that something they thought they could almost take for granted was just thrown in their faces. And that's what gives me faith in America. That's what gives me confidence in this country, because this is the most patriotic country on the planet, and the only one with a constitution that puts the people in control of the government. And when push comes to shove, hundreds of millions of Americans still understand that and will still vote the right way, despite 50 years of propaganda to the opposite. And that's a real testament to both the American system and the American people.
No, you're right. And Trevor, one of the things that came out of that election, I think most people realize that there were also a lot of the numbers that ended up being Democratic votes were really manipulated numbers. I mean, we had people voting in Ohio and different states around the country that had been dead for a very long time. We had a lot of voter fraud throughout the country, and in spite of that, in spite of all those numbers, and the numbers have been as high as 25 to 30 million voters, in spite of that, the constitutionalists or the conservatives ended up winning the election, and that absolutely destroyed the left.
Yeah, look, and you're right. You can allow, in Democratic controlled areas, you can allow probably 10 to 15% vote fraud in many elections. And the fact that we still win elections like that handicap is another testament to the American people. If all elections in America were free and fair and there was no cheating, you would find a collapse of the Democratic vote right across the country. You would find a sweep. So, but they are dishonest. They don't play by the same rules we do. Their agenda is winning at all costs, because they believe they have right on their side, that socialism is the answer, and that cheating to achieve it is moral. So we have to understand that they are not playing by the same rules we are. And one thing I'd love to see Jeff Sessions do as Attorney General is start coming after vote fraudsters and prosecute and jail some of them. Once a few of them started serving big federal prison sentences, you would see that problem disappear very quickly, and you'd see a lot of Democratic seats change hands very quickly. I think it's quite shocking. America is one of the few countries in the world that is so loose in its election laws. I'm not look. If you look at New Zealand, for example, you have to pre-register several months before the election, and you have to come in on election day with photographic ID and mark your name off against the rolls, and then you can vote. We don't have vote fraud in New Zealand. Most countries don't have it, because most Western countries don't have it because they have these voter registration systems. And that is one major flaw in the U.S. system. It has allowed the Democrats and the criminals to gain undue influence.
Right, and that lack of proper identification, there's been a number of different attempts to try to straighten that out and try to make the voter registration process a lot more, let's say, transparent, and to make sure that people that vote are actually citizens of the United States. There's been a huge attempt on the left to destroy that system, as you pointed out, and for the most part, they've been successful with that.
Well, yeah, look, in California, they've, the communist Gil Cedillo, until recently the Democratic head of the California State Senate, pushed through a law giving illegal driver's licenses. So they will then use those driver's licenses as the ID necessary to vote. So look. Some people may disagree with me on this, but I would say if you want to vote in federal elections, I think the federal government has a right to set standards in the states. States control their own elections, that's fine, but if you're sending people to the federal government, to the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House, I think the federal government has a right to step in and say these are the standards required, and that is free registration, no electronic ballots, all paper ballots, and photo ID presented on the day to be marked off a roll. If those measures were instituted statewide, it would change the politics. United States wide, that would change the politics of this country. And who could object to honest voting? Well, the only people who could object are the criminals who are now running several states like Illinois. They might worry about it, but any decent, honest American would be happy to see that implemented.
Right, and the other thing that you've brought out in your books, and certainly you brought out in the lectures that you've done, are how many of our Congress people, and I'd like to kind of get into that a little bit, how many of our Congress people are really influenced or totally controlled by the left, and how that not only is in the Congress, but the religious aspects of our country are being changed before our very eyes. And I know that we're getting a little far afield from the UN, but the point is, and we'll do a recap on the UN toward the end of the show, all of these programs are programs that the UN has been pushing.
Yeah, well, the UN basically has been pushing this sort of interfaith movement. They really want a one-world religion, which is a sort of a combination of Christianity and Buddhism and Islam and a sort of Gaia, the sort of worship of the earth. And if people don't believe that, just check out, Google some of their publications and things they're promoting. The UN really wants a one-world religion. And it won't be a very good religion, I can assure you of that. It'll be basically a socialist religion. So, but if you look at American churches, there's a lot of corruption, a lot of socialism creeping into the churches, even the evangelical churches, which have been relatively pure up till now. And that's why my next movie project will be Enemies Within the Church. We're going to look at the way that false doctrines have crept into the church, how overt Marxism is creeping into the church. A lot of these young Christians are being indoctrinated with things like global warming and social justice and welcoming illegal immigrants into the country, etc., all of which is pure Marxist doctrine. But you put a Christian veneer on it, and you feed this to young people, and they lap it up because they don't have the discernment to understand truth from fiction. So, yeah, the churches are being corrupted at a tremendous rate. That happened in the 40s and 30s through the Soviet controlled World Council of Churches, but now it's happening today in the evangelical churches through the social justice movement, another variant of Marxism. And then you've got Congress, which is completely infiltrated by bad guys, and my books and my movies name who these people are. Enemieswithinmovie.com is trending on Amazon right now because it actually names the names of the people who are doing this, the infiltrators in your Congress and your Senate.
Right, Trevor, and one of the things that, pop out to me is that if, in fact, that wasn't factual information, because you're going to have your detractors that are going to say, well, that's all nonsense. Somebody ought to sue him. Well, guess what? When you are that factual and you name names and show relationships and can do it that way, it takes away their ability to be able to try to intimidate you. And so they just try to ignore you. That's why it's so important that our listeners buy your books and watch your DVDs, because in reality, if this wasn't factual information, it would have been disposed of a long time ago.
Well, look, nobody has ever disputed me for a point of fact, and as I say, the movie Enemies Within is available on Amazon Prime right now. It's had over 100,000 unique views in the last month. And you'd think if there was some garbage in there that people would complain. But you can't, because it's all factual evidence. It's drawn from these people's own writings, their own, own video appearances, etc. And it's very interesting on Amazon, on Amazon where the DVD is available as well, The Enemies Within. They have a rating system. Well, there's over 700 comments there and ratings. About 75% of them are 5s, the best you can get, and about 20% of them are 1s, the worst you can possibly get. There's virtually none in the middle. So people either absolutely love it and think it's fantastic, or they're so angered by it, so upset by it, they give it an automatic 1 rating. Even though there's no evidence ever presented, no disputing of any points of fact, the left-wing trolls are going on there and trying to drag the average down by just giving automatic 1s. But the people who actually take the time to watch it are giving it 5s or 4s on virtually every single occasion. It's a very interesting phenomenon, actually.
Well, it really does point out the fact that, the left is terrified of truth, and you're bringing the truth to the citizens of the United States via a product that, the movie, if you're not a book reader, then get the movie, because the movie explains an awful lot about what's happening to our country. And it does it in a very, very succinct, very intelligent way. And it does it in a way that is very hard for the opposite side to try to refute, because everything is documented. That's the one thing over the years that I've known you, Trevor, is that you do a tremendous job of researching and documenting and making sure that all the information that you provide is 100% verifiable.
Yeah, look, my credibility is my biggest asset, really. If I say it, it's because I've researched it. And I spend hundreds, if not thousands of hours in archives and trolling the internet and interviewing people. I've interviewed former KGB officers. I've interviewed CIA people. I've interviewed former communists. You name it, right across this country. Spent thousands of hours in archives in Madison, Wisconsin, and Seattle, Washington, and Los Angeles, and gone into communist bookshops and scoured their archives, etc. So, I've got the goods to back it up. I can, without any doubt, I can say to you there are at least 100 members of your House and 20 members of your Senate who are security risks, who are so enmeshed with enemies of your country, they shouldn't be allowed reins of power. And so, challenge me, take me to court, disprove my information. I dare anybody to try it, and nobody's done it yet. Nobody's even attempted it.
Right. Well, it's your information is very factual, so for that very reason, they can't do a whole lot to it. Trevor, I'm wanting to get back to this thing with the UN. I want our people to realize, and you've done a lot of research on the UN over the years, but I want our people to realize that the UN its very structure was based on, as you said, communism. The architects of the UN were communists, and it was very intentionally done that way to bring the system together in a way that would eventually eliminate the United States of America as a constitutional republic. A lot of these globalists believe this vision for the future is the right one, but they, at the same time, they have to do things that are so devious and so below the radar to accomplish their goals. And that, I believe, will be the ultimate expose of the UN, will be the fact that they've done so much of this stuff clandestinely. Can you talk to our listeners about some of the things that they've done over the decades that you're aware of that really, let's say, fly below the radar, that have been happening at the international level, but that if average Americans understood, they'd be appalled?
Yeah, well, look, United Nations was set up after World War II. The first attempt was the League of Nations, which was set up after World War I by the same sort of people to achieve the same ends. But the American public never supported it, so it never got off the ground. So after World War II, you had so many Soviet spies working in Washington, D.C., in the State Department and other organizations, more than 500, they believe, that they were able to get the UN off the ground. And the architect of it was a man called Alger Hiss, who was later identified as a full, paid-up, secret member of the Communist Party USA and a Soviet agent. So they got the UN underway. They set up a Security Council, which had permanent members, Russia and China, the two major communist powers, United States, Britain, and one other power, which rotated. So they always had a bias towards the communists right from the start. I had a friend who trained in Moscow in '83, just before Gorbachev came to power, and he said the 6,000 students at the school he was at, Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning, International Communist Training School, and he was always told by the Soviet instructors, the United Nations is our thing. We control it. It's our instrument of policy. It is our instrument for achieving dominance in the world. This was at a communist training school. They were taught that. America was paying the bills, but the Russians, the Soviets, were calling the shots every single time. So you have a whole, under UNESCO, which is a subgroup of the United Nations, you have a whole machine pumping out educational materials to schools all over the world, setting educational standards, etc., including in American schools. So you've got this brainwashing factory going. Then the other aspect of the recently has been going on is the United Nations refugee program. What the United Nations wants to do is not just distribute wealth worldwide, it wants to redistribute populations worldwide, which is why they have put pressure on member governments to take large numbers of refugees from the third world into Europe and the United States, which is why you're seeing thousands, tens of thousands of Somali Muslim refugees and Muslim refugees from the Middle East pouring into little towns in America. We were in Walmart, Minnesota today, a town of 15,000 people right in the rural heartland of Minnesota, a very conservative area. In that town, there are 5,000 Somali Muslim refugees. The entire downtown has been taken over by Somali Muslims. This is not accidental. The United Nations is deliberately pouring third world populations into the heart of the developed countries to redistribute population and wealth, to destroy the conservative voting base, to destroy conservative and Christian communities and countries, so that the whole place may be more easily amalgamated into the United Nations world superstate. And for instance, one of the main publicity officers organizing this program, based out of New York, is a woman called Taryn Fivak. She works for the United Nations Refugee Resettlement Program and is a card-carrying member of the Workers' World Party, a communist party that supports Iran and Russia and Cuba and China. So this is the kind of thing that's going on. And you've got United Nations, the Agenda 21 as well. You want me to talk a little bit about that, Dan?
Right, Trevor, we're going to have to take a break here, but please keep that thought in mind. I'd like to continue with that after the break.
Yep.
Now we can rejoin with our guest today, Trevor Loudon. Trevor, you were talking about how the mass immigration movement of radical Islam is being used as a way to soften and weaken society. And I absolutely agree with your observations, because if you want to destroy a nation, destroy its social fabric and its religion. And that's exactly what these open border policies are allowing in the United States. And these come directly from the UN.
Yeah, the UN is dictating America's immigration policies. It's the same within Europe. Europe and America are the ones mainly targeted. You know, Russia's not taken any immigrants. Saudi Arabia's not taken any immigrants. It is only basically United States and Europe, because they are the main impediments to a world government. They are the main impediments to the totalitarian taking over. And immigration is being used as a deliberate policy to weaken all of these Western countries to the point where they can be easily amalgamated. They can be softened up to the point where they will no longer offer resistance.
Right, and there's a recent article that I was just reading, and I was referring to a little earlier, but the Catalonia district in Spain, they are now in the process, and George Soros is funding an effort to go into that area and breaking that region in apart from the Spanish state, and getting the Catalonians to accept a regional government and city-states, and that's what they're doing literally all over the world. They're starting that process, and if they do that, I mean, it makes perfect sense. If you've got a strong national fabric, you're not going to be able to take over and control them with a world government. But if you've got a very weakened social fabric, that's the country has been broken into many regions or city-states or smaller, let's say smaller areas, they're going to be weak, and they're going to be very easy to manipulate and very easy to control.
Well, that's exactly right. The Russians are heavily involved through the anti-globalization movement of Russia, which is a Putin front. They're heavily involved in promoting Catalan independence. The radical communist groups in Spain are all behind it. They want to break up Spain. They want to destroy that national state. These are the same people behind the Basque independence movement and many others. Like, I'm all for breaking up the European Union because it's a socialist superstate. I want to see France and Germany as independent free nations. But the actual movement to destroy these countries, and Spain is the number one target right now through the Catalan independence movement, are being orchestrated from Moscow supported by George Soros and other radical leftists, to basically destroy that country's national integrity. And as you say, if you can do that, you can soften it up and you can take that country over. The same people who are doing that are supporting the Texas independence movement in America. They're supporting the Californian independence movement, and they're supporting Black Lives Matter and the Maoist movements that are working now in Mississippi through their control of Jackson, Mississippi. So, yeah, these separatist communist movements are working all over the Western world to destroy the countries as they have, so they can break up the national integrity of these countries so they can more easily be amalgamated at a later time into a superstate.
Right, and your comments on this are obviously designed to wake Americans up.
Yeah, look, America is the freest, richest, most benevolent country in the world. Americans don't have to confront evil very often in their own shores, inside their own country, and that makes for a very wonderful people. But there's also an element of naivety and complacency involved with that. Most countries in the world understand dictatorship because that's how they live. Americans don't understand dictatorship because that's not how you live. And so you are having your freedom eroded every day, but you're so trusting that most Americans think the government is still on their side. That the Democrats are really just okay people. The rhinos really have your best interest at heart. Well, I want people to wake up and understand there is evil stalking the planet right now. There's a move towards centralized control, towards dictatorship and the end of national sovereignty. And that movement is way, way more advanced than most people understand. And unless we wake up to it and fight back real quickly, it's going to slip away. One more Democratic administration that legalizes all of the illegal immigrants in the country, and really, from that point on, you would have lost complete control. It only takes one more election, and we lose complete control in this country.
Also, if we look at it this way too, Trevor, one of the other ways that this can happen is if we lose the Senate or lose the House. And frankly, we've got the same kind of problem in the state of Montana that I think we have at the federal level. And that is there are a lot of people calling themselves Republicans that give us the impression that we have the actual majority when in fact we don't, because even though they call themselves Republicans, they vote like Democrats. And they use the Republican moniker because it's easier in their district to get elected as a Republican, even though their ideology may be totally different than what the Republican Party is supposed to stand for.
Well, that's right, because Americans are so trusting. They don't believe that their politicians would lie so blatantly. But, the Democratic Party, Democrats have been infiltrating the Republican Party for a long time. So even in the states where you have a huge Republican majority, you really don't. Because, usually in most states, at least a third to a half of the Republicans are basically Democrats in drag. They're false Republicans. So that's why I'm so keen to get behind Steve Bannon, to get more conservatives into the U.S. Senate. We don't need even a majority. We just need a substantial minority, because a lot of these Republicans are just go along to get along. They'll go along with the most powerful faction. And that was proven under Ronald Reagan. The Republicans hated Reagan, but the grassroots forced him on the Republican Party. And when he started being successful in turning around the country and had a few key allies around him, most of the go-alongs to get along went along with him. just to get re-elected, if nothing else. Well, if Steve Bannon can replace 6 or 7 or even 6 or 7 rhino Republicans with real conservative Republicans in the Senate, that would make a huge difference to advancing President Trump's agenda. It would make it so much easier for him to get done what he needs to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That'll do it. And if we can get our people to vote a little more sensibly and do a little bit more research on the people that they're electing and voting into public office, I think we'd be a whole lot better off as a nation, because we would have let's say an electorate that is responsible, instead of just voting for the prettiest face or a buzzword or something like that. We need to get people to actually do a little investigation into the backgrounds and into the policies of the people that are running for office. And that hasn't happened in the United States for quite a long time. That's the reason that we get some of these ringers. And we need to realize that they aren't there to protect our best interests. They're there to make money and to protect their best interests and to promote their agenda. And right now their agenda, at least for very many of them, their agenda is an anti-American, anti-republic agenda.
Absolutely. And most Americans for a long time relied on their media to do the vetting for them. Well, I think we all see the flaws in that now, that wasn't a wise strategy, because the media is just not trustworthy. If you look at very simple things like, Mitt Romney, the Republican candidate, the media investigated everything they could about him. They told us that he allegedly beat up some young gay kid when he was 17. They told us that what he did with his dog on holiday, everything about his business affairs. Sarah Palin, they went to Alaska and they went through her kids' Facebook pages. Nothing was out off limits. No amount of intrusion was bad, because their argument was very simple, that these people might be leading your country and you have a right to know their backgrounds. Well, absolutely you do, and I support that. But why is the same standard not applied to Barack Obama and his elephant's graveyard of skeletons? Why wasn't the same standard applied to Hillary Clinton and her just raft of scandalous and treasonous behavior? The fact is, if you're a rhino or you're a Democrat, you get a free pass. If you're a conservative or somebody who might threaten the left's agenda, they go over you with a fine-tooth comb. Well, I don't object to that. I just want to see that same standard applied right across the board. And I don't think that's unreasonable in any way to ask for that. Do you?
No, I agree. It is a double standard, and it's so obvious, I think, to average Americans that we are living under not only a double standard, but an obvious skewing of reality and facts to try to promote a political agenda that is distinctly anti-American. One more discussion of the Antifa, the group that you have so, let's say, thoroughly and succinctly exposed in this latest film that you've done. I want to our listeners know that they can actually go back to historical photos from the Nazi Germany period, where Antifa was having rallies in Germany, and the communist hammer and sickle was on either side of the Antifa flag. And this is something that, if people question whether it's communism that's against the so-called fascism, the reality is they're communist organizations, and now many of the groups that are that are causing strife around the country are open communists, and we can identify them as open communists. Is that right, Trevor?
Well, absolutely. Well, you look at the people who are toppling Confederate statues in North Carolina, for instance. That was the Workers' World Party. 11 people were arrested for that. All of them were members of the Workers' World Party, which is a group, as I said, that supports Russia and China and Iran and Cuba. The Black Lives Matter movement is completely controlled by the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which is a pro-Chinese communist outfit. This wasn't three young girls who just were upset about police brutality. This is Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and April Tometi, who invented the Black Lives Matter hashtag, and all of those ladies are very actively involved in fronts for the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. One of them was trained by a guy called Eric Mann, who was a former member of the Weathermen, the precursor to the Weather Underground terrorist organization. So, and then Antifa on the streets is completely a communist organization. They with flags all the time, and they're made up of a succession of communist and anarchist groups around. But one thing I want to say about Antifa, you'll notice that most of the Antifa violence has occurred in cities like Baltimore, Maryland, Boston, Massachusetts, Charlottesville, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, and the Bay Area. The thing that all those cities have in common is that controlled by left-wing Democrat city councils. And virtually every one of those places have come reports that the police have been ordered to stand down while Antifa commits its violent activities, beats up Trump supporters, burns flags, burns buildings, crashes cars, you name it. Antifa in those cities is the military wing of the Democratic Party. They are very heavily tied to the Democrats. They're trained by the Democrat-controlled unions, funded by the unions, funded to some degree by George Soros, and they are, and his allies, they are an anti-American military outfit. And on November the 4th, Antifa groups are planning to start an insurgency in this country against President Trump. They're openly talking about it. They're going to start riots and marches. They want to do an Arab Spring type of operation and increase the demonstrations to the point where the Trump administration folds. And they're openly talking about it. They're funded by anti-American activists. And the federal government should be coming down hard on these people right now, because what they're doing, they're committing felonies here, and they should be in jail. So we need to be watching out for this.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, Trevor, because I was going to mention the fact that right now, all over the internet, there are indications that Antifa is going to be leading these so-called protests, but riots, and they are even talking for open revolution on the 4th of November. And it's going to be in many of the major cities throughout the United States that they're going to attempt to do this. We need to make sure that we crack down, and as Americans, we need to make sure that we demand that our local governments not allow this kind of rioting to take place. It's one thing to protect the First Amendment, which I think we all really care very deeply to protect. It's another thing to allow open communist aggression to destroy our system of government to exist in the United States. I just think we need to, as Americans, stand up and be counted this time around. And Trevor, I have to tell you, I don't know anyone in this country that does a better job of exposing this sort of thing than you do, and I really appreciate you for doing that.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. And there's a lot of good people out there, and I rely on others to help me as well. But Sometimes I think it's an advantage having a foreign voice. People will listen to a foreigner sometimes more than they will someone from their own country. But look, I've done the research. I stand by everything I say. And America is living in a pre-revolutionary situation right now. There are people out there working inside the country, allied with Russia, allied with the United Nations, allied with Cuba and Iran, who are intent on creating chaos inside this country to stall or even bring down the Trump administration. And we have to face the fact that this is happening and take it very seriously. I think the federal government needs to be much more actively involved in rooting the enemies out of this country. These people are committing felonies on a daily basis, and they're being allowed to get away with it. And if this country is to survive, that cannot be allowed to continue.
Well, I agree, and I think it's time for Americans to quit being the silent majority and start being the vocal majority, because we need to understand that the actual numbers of communists in this country that are dedicated to this cause are very small numbers, but yet they are now the tail wagging the dog.
Yep, they'll be less than probably 2% of the population at most. But, Lenin, when he took over Russia, had 2,000 Bolsheviks. And that was a country of 160 or 180 million at the time. 2,000 Bolsheviks were able to take over Russia. Castro had a few hundred guys when they took over Cuba. A small, organized minority will always beat an unorganized majority. Or we are the majority, or we have to get organized and start fighting back and use the freedoms that we have to do so while we still have the opportunity, because it's slipping away fast and we cannot be complacent about this.
Hello. Yes. Is this Christopher?
It is, yes.
Boy, I tell you, we're. I'm gonna, if you don't mind, Christopher, we're at the very end of the show here, and I'm going to see if can we try to arrange to have you come back on by yourself on another date, and I'll just send you information on it.
Yes, do. Yes, I've been here all this time, but no calls come through. So
I can't believe it. We're here. I've got you at the end of the show, and I wish.
Well, I called you. You see, and got through straight away. But nobody called me.
Okay.
So what we'll do is set it up for another date. You find another date, and I'll happily do the whole show with you. I'll be delighted.
All right. Well, thank you, Christopher. I appreciate that, and I will get back on the radio with my guest Trevor Loudon. Hopefully, we can do this again. Thank you.
Okay.